Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Bruno Bosteels. He's going to be delivering the first faculty lecture of this reunion, the 2021 virtual reunion. It's on the human experience. Thank you, Professor Bosteels. As many of you may know, you might have read his bio. He's a professor in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures in the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. His research covers some incredibly fascinating topics on literature, culture, politics in modern Latin America, as well as contemporary philosophy and political theory. His lecture will connect the core's enduring themes, something we were just talking about with Jim, to the unprecedented events of this year, last year, by exploring how resilience can emerge post-chaos, how values of society may be criticized and reset because of the vulnerabilities and limitations that are often revealed in a crisis. That sounds incredible. Professor Bosteels, thank you for being with us today. I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. Welcome to you, alumni, and thank you all for joining us today. So I've been asked to speak to you about the human experience in the midst of the worldwide crisis that is the current pandemic, with special attention for the role that texts from the Columbia core, such as literature, humanities, and contemporary civilization, could play in thinking about the recovery. I should apologize in advance that what I will present today does not follow the discussion format that typically should characterize all courses in the core. We will make sure to leave enough time for the Q&A at the end, but unfortunately, I cannot recreate the atmosphere of a group discussion here online in the way that I would have liked. Of course, ever since the great books debates of the 1990s, programs such as the core haven't stopped being subjected to a thorough questioning. And every teacher of the core today is certainly aware of this conflicted legacy. So usually at the beginning of my class in CC or Contemporary Civilization, I ask my students whether they had come to Columbia because of the core, in spite of the core, or were as yet undecided on the topic. And perhaps not to your surprise, the answers tend to be fairly evenly distributed among all three options. I only see it as my task to bring as many students as possible over to the sites where they can engage critically and constructively with this tradition without falling in the twin traps of empty progressivism or reactive gloom and doom. As my guideline for such an approach towards what we might call a form of critical humanities, I always refer to a provocative statement from Walter Benjamin. For those of you who are not familiar with his name, Benjamin was a German Jewish intellectual, cultural critic, and for some time a close collaborator of the Institute for Social Research, better known as the Frankfurt School, which during its years in exile after Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, was actually located on West 117th Street in Manhattan and closely associated with Columbia University. Now, contrary to the Frankfurt School's most famous members, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, Benjamin was unable to reach the United States from France. On the night of September 26, 1940, after crossing the Pyrenees in a desperate attempt to flee from the Gestapo, he took his own life in the Spanish border town of Port-Beau. Just a few months earlier, he had penned several versions of a text that many would come to consider his testament, a text titled On the Concept of History, also known as Thesis on the Philosophy of History, one version of which he had left with his close friend Hannah Arendt, and another he sent in April or May of 1940 to Gretel Adorno, Theodor Adorno's spouse, with the following explanation. The war and the constellation that brought it about led me to take down a few thoughts, which I can say that I have kept with me, indeed kept for myself, for nearly 20 years. Even today, I am handing them to you more as a bouquet of whispering grasses gathered on reflective walks than a collection of theses. Now, in the seventh of these theses, or whispering grasses, Benjamin calls attention to the fact that all so-called cultural treasures, including the artworks hoarded up in world-famous museums, but also presumably the great books that are systematically taught in Colombia's core are actually the spoils of war and conquest. From this melancholy insight, he draws the following striking conclusion. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism taints also the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. I often ask my students to think of this thesis as their guiding thread for looking at so-called Western civilization with detachment of a critical eye capable of recognizing at all times the entwinement of civilization and barbarism. As Benjamin further writes in another remarkable image, this would require that we learn how to brush history against the grain by refusing any and all complicity with the dominant view. For if the annals of history are indeed written by the victors, the task of the critical humanities would be to wrest and retrieve the tradition of the vanquished and the oppressed from among the ruins. This is not to say, of course, that some of the founding documents of Western civilization were not also written as attempts at consolation and repair in response to an overwhelming crisis or a traumatic experience, perhaps similar to the one the world is going through, however unevenly, at this very moment. I'm thinking in particular of Augustine's City of God, a massive theological treatise that doubles as perhaps the first universal history. The initial and more immediate motivation for which was to respond to the many men and women who were in need of emotional support after suffering so much violence, destruction, and pain during the sack of Rome in the year 410 of the Common Era at the hands of the Visigoths coming from the north. How could this much suffering be reconciled with Christianity as the new official religion of the Roman Empire? This is what Augustine set out to explain. Thus, from the very opening lines of City of God, he wonders out loud whether those who reproach the new Christian religion for the suffering that Rome was undergoing should not rather attribute their salvation to God's providential plan for humanity. Thus, Augustine wrote, "Escaped multitudes who now reproach the Christian religion and impute to Christ the ills that have befallen their city, but the preservation of their own life, a boon which they owe to the respect entertained for Christ by the barbarians, they attribute not to our Christ, but to their own good luck. They ought rather, had they any right perceptions, to attribute the severities and hardships inflicted by their enemies to that divine providence, which is wont to reform the depraved manners of men by chastisement, and which exercises with similar afflictions the righteous and praiseworthy, either translating them, when they have passed through the trial to a better world, or detaining them still on earth for ulterior purposes." From this immediate concern for the well-being and the consolation of the soul in the midst of Rome's invasion by the so-called barbarians, Augustine goes on to develop one of the most ambitious philosophies of world history, narrated in a redemptive key as a journey or pilgrimage from the fall of original sin to the promise of salvation on the day of judgment. What should draw our attention here is the form in which Augustine tells the history of the world as a story of destruction, temptation, and redemption. In many ways, City of God is the world historical projection of a story of which Augustine's earlier confessions represented the personal or autobiographical account. Incidentally, this also means that for me as a critic, there is no significant difference between a book of literature and texts of moral or political philosophy, even though, as you know, the Columbia Core tends to split these up between Lidham and CC. Both kinds of texts are ways of becoming aware of the contradictions of one's own time and finding them out in the struggle between so-called civilization and barbarism, which perhaps is but a sophisticated way of referring to the paths reserved for the dominant and the oppressed in society. For Walter Benjamin, however, the problem with all universal history is its reliance on a concept of historical time as a giant continuum of boundless and uninterrupted progress. In this sense, universal history invariably sides with the victors and glorifies earthly success as moral righteousness. To this dominant point of view, Benjamin then opposes another that would be able to bring the flow of time to a momentary standstill, and in this instant of the now, recognize a radically transformative promise. Now, perhaps we may obtain an inkling of what this means in another historical moment, not in the year 410 with the sack of Rome, but exactly 1,111 years later, in 1521, with the fall of the ancient city of Tenochtitlan, the site of what thereafter would become Mexico City. Until recently, this was a moment discussed in the core, if it was discussed at all, only from the vantage point of the Spanish conquerors, chroniclers, evangelizers, theologians, and jurists. In part, of course, this default position was due to the fact that most indigenous accounts, both of the conquest and of pre-Hispanic times, were destroyed by the Spaniards, on the grounds that supposedly they were pagan expressions of idolatry or barbarism. And yet, as early as with the arrival of a group of Franciscan friars, among them Bernardino de Sahagún, attempts were also made to reconstruct the indigenous accounts by relying on native informants in ways that for many interpreters today read like something like ethnographic fieldwork. No doubt, the most ambitious project of this kind is the collective endeavor spearheaded by Sahagún in the second half of the 16th century. This too, by the way, was a time marked twice over by the pain and suffering of an epidemic. First, during the War of Conquest between 1520 and 1521, when perhaps as many as half of the indigenous population of Tenochtitlan fell victim to the new disease of smallpox brought over from Europe via the Caribbean. And then again in the 1570s, when Sahagún and his team had to rush against time to finish their final copy of the manuscript to avoid the onslaught of yet another cycle of the epidemic, before a royal decree in 1585 would ban any further investigations of this kind into the habits and culture of the indigenous populations. To be sure, the 12 books that make up the general history of things of New Spain remain written from the vantage point of the conquerors, and they serve the purpose of information management in order better to control the indigenous population. To use the words of the Indian scholar Ranaki Guha, we would have to say that they continue to be the prose of counterinsurgency. Nevertheless, Sahagún's work may be able to give us a glimpse of the tradition of the oppressed because of its inclusion of the original account in Nahuatl, as well as the copious pictographic images that served the native informants as the initial jumping-off points for telling their story. The result is a bilingual, if not trilingual, if we include the images, treatise that certainly rivals with Augustine's City of God in ambition and scope. By the mid-1950s, moreover, scholars in the Nahua language and culture had been able to retranslate the columns in Nahuatl that Sahagún had freely paraphrased and sometimes just summarized in a heavily Christianized Spanish. Thus, the indigenous Aztec or Mexica account of the conquest of Mexico, in the final book 12 of the general history, in particular, figures prominently in a selection that would become and remains today a best-selling book in Mexico, namely La Visión de los Vencidos, that is literally the vision of the vanquished, better known in its official English translation under the title The Broken Spears. It is almost as if Walter Benjamin's hope in what became his final text or testament had become a possibility in the discontinuous history of Mexico, itself part of the colonial expansion of Western civilization into the Americas. That is, the hope to catch a glimpse of redemption when a moment from the past flashes up before our eyes to shed light on the tradition of the vanquished. Almost as if in a photographic negative of Augustine's account of the sack of Rome by the Visigoths from the north, here is how Sahagún's indigenous informants remembered a particularly violent episode during the War of Conquest. That is, the massacre in the Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan in May 1520, when the Spanish troops, temporarily under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, while Hernán Cortés battled Pánfilo de Narváez in the Gulf of Mexico, interrupted the religious festival in honor of the Aztec gods and began to kill and maim the unarmed celebrants who were trapped inside the temple. And they tell Sahagún, some attempted to force their way out, but the Spaniards murdered them at the gates. Others climbed the walls, but they could not save themselves. Those who ran into the communal houses were saved there for a while. So were those who lay down among the victims and pretended to be dead. But if they stood up again, the Spaniards saw them and killed them. Violent episodes such as these would become foundational moments in the history of Mexico. Most often, they would be remembered and passed down from generation to generation in the form of canciones tristes, or sad songs, which together with the memoriales de agravios, or memorials of grievances, would become the dominant forms or genres for writing history, not only in Mexico, but in many other parts of Latin America as well. A few of these songs are also included in the anthology The Broken Spears and refer to the dead and the ruins left behind after the definitive fall of Mexico Tenochtitlan on August 13, 1521. And all these misfortunes befell us. We saw them and wondered at them. We suffered this unhappy fate. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. Worms are swarming in the streets and plazas, and the walls are splattered with gore. The water has turned red as if it were dyed, and when we drink it, it has the taste of brine. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls, for our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead. Now in Spanish, this last line reads much more poignantly. Era nuestra herencia una red de agujeros. That is, our inheritance was a net full of holes. Tragically, the same sad song could be recited again 4 centuries later when on October 2nd of 1968, a few days before the inauguration of the Mexican Olympic Games, more than 200 student activists, sympathizers, and bystanders were massacred on the Plaza of Tlatelolco, also known as the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, or Square of the Three Cultures, for its combination of pre-Hispanic ruins, the colonial church of Santiago de Tlatelolco, and our modern housing project that was the pride of President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. Such a cyclical repetition of violence, as constitutive of the history of modern civilization, however, still does not allow us to bring the flow of time to a momentary halt in order for the tradition of the oppressed to flash up in an instant of recognizability. For this to happen, I believe that we completely have to change the perspective we adopt. Instead of focusing our attention on the enormous amount of violence, suffering, and pain that underpins the history of humankind, this would require that we retrieve the moments of collective resilience and rebellion in the face of such traumatic experiences. Let us go back, for example, to the passage in the General History of Things of New Spain about the massacre in the Templo Mayor. What the 20th century Nahuatl specialist Ángel María Garibay here retranslates as communal houses, which Sahagún had rendered as capillas de los cues, or chapels of the indigenous temples. In the original Nahua version is said calpulco, that is, the place of the calpuli, a term which in turn is translated most often as ward or neighborhood, or in Sahagún's Christianized version as parish. This is the characteristic term used to describe the social, territorial, and administrative subdivisions of ancient Mexico Tenochtitlan. Much ink has flowed since then from historians and anthropologists in Mexico as well as in the United States to define the exact nature of the calpuli. Was this a clan-like kinship structure? Was it an economic unit similar to a large tenement housing complex, or a political and economic subdivision based on collective land ownership? Or, especially in the heavily centralized social stratification of the Aztec Empire, had this already been reduced to nothing more than a simple territorial unit, of which there were 20 in Tenochtitlan by the time the Spaniards arrived? What we know from the very few surviving illustrated codices or manuscripts that give us a view of the indigenous versions is that originally there were a limited number of calpultin or calpoltin, maybe as many as 8, that together constituted the people who, after a long migration from mythical Aztlan, would end up founding Tenochtitlan on the lake of Texcoco. This is how the word appears, for example, in a description of the 8 houses, clans, or nations, naciones, at the start of the genealogical account known as the Codex Mexicanus. This is a late 16th century manuscript sort of trying to reconstruct one of these genealogical scrolls. But later, especially with a heightened centralization and stratification of social power in the city of Tenochtitlan, this meaning of a kinship relation most likely already gave way to a purely territorial or administrative designation. More important than the exact nature of the calpuli or calpoli, which may have been very different from one place or time to the next, is the prolonged afterlife this idea would have in the region. This is because the loss of communal land ownership, a process that had begun long before the arrivals of the Spaniards, would be lived as the index of a promise of which the indigenous populations were robbed for hundreds of years more after the fall of Tenochtitlan. Even if this was therefore the result of a retroactive illusion, heightened by the continued expropriation of communal lands by a few large land-owning families throughout the colonial period, the idea of a better way of life survived all these years of turmoil and unrest as a promise of redemption, ready to rise to the surface again and again at regular intervals. One such interval opened up right before the Mexican Revolution in 1909, when, according to the painstaking reconstruction of the historian Jesus Sotelo Inclán, Emiliano Zapata was elected by the elderly as the calpuleque, that is, the chief of what would still be lived and experienced as a calpuli in his hometown of Anenecuilco in the southern state of Morelos. After gaining the trust of one of Zapata's closest allies, General Chico Franco, Sotelo Inclán was able to have access to the so-called primordial papers, or land titles, many of them still written in Nahuatl, that connect Zapata across 4 centuries with the initial period of conquests and colonization. And this historian writes as a conclusion, after he reconstructs the different lists of the chosen calpuleques in Anenecuilco, the last one of which would have been Emilio Zapata, The different mentions of the Calpuleques of Anenecuilco are so many links in a long chain that perhaps suffers no interruption in traversing several centuries. Of course, there are many links missing, but is it not admirable that so many concrete data about them have been preserved? If from the remotest times they form a straight line that reaches all the way to Emiliano Zapata, we have reason to affirm that he too was a Calpuleque. The time behind this chain is not the time of what Benjamin criticizes as the empty continuum of progress. It is a time of discontinuity and intermittency, pointing toward the current uprising of communal efforts at self-organization that punctuate the history of human civilization as so many instances of a truly transformative promise. Now, the Mexican Revolution, too, would be marked by the tragedy of a worldwide pandemic, as the 1918 influenza decimated the local population and utterly depleted the human potential behind Zapata's experiment in collective land reform and self-government in the southern state of Morelos. Is it possible again today to imagine such a redemptive return of the past into the present, whether in Mexico, which I've studied a bit more and for this reason focused on for you today, or in the United States? What are the chances for history to come to a standstill and interrupt the empty time of progress with the promise of a collective recovery? Are we ready to brush history against the grain in this way in order to retrieve the tradition of the oppressed? Much will depend, I believe, on how we envisage our past and remain alert to the fact that there is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. This does not mean that we jettison all the cultural treasures studied in the core, in lit hum or in contemporary civilization, as just so many spoils of war and conquest. But for me at least, it means that we should engage with them in the manner of a critical humanist, or following the methods and guidelines of what Walter Benjamin preferred to call a historical materialist. Without letting ourselves be enchanted by the soothsayers who speak shallowly of a better tomorrow, this requires of us, I believe, that we pay attention to the unheard voices of the downtrodden and the oppressed. That is, all those anonymous forces who toil away in the long shadows cast by the few geniuses responsible for all those great books. To conclude with one more image of history at a standstill, allow me to go back one last time to the capital city of Mexico. Here, just a few years ago, the oldest known house in the historical center was being retrieved and rebuilt as a community center. In the image, you can see a mason working on the interior patio. As the Associated Press reported for the US edition of The Guardian, this house is laid out on a pre-Hispanic plan known as a calpuli, a sort of extended family that formed the basic building block of Aztec society, according to Mariano Leiva, the director of the historic Downtown Trust, which was restoring the building for use as a community center. And the journalist adds, perhaps in reference to those houses that ended up roofless during the fall of Tenochtitlan, today the house is getting new roofs and the centuries-old paving stones are being relaid in the courtyard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Bosteels, for your riveting lecture today, taking us on a terrific exploration on the human experience and helping us to refamiliarize ourselves with the themes and questions that we debated when we were students at Columbia. To my fellow Columbia alumni, I am Mary Lee Harrington, CC class of 2001, celebrating my 20th college reunion this year with my fellow CC alumni. I'm delighted to moderate the Q&A portion of today's event with Professor Bosteels. Not surprisingly, we have questions submitted from CC alumni who, as in their Columbia days, are proving to be just as intellectually curious as in decades past, and to engage with themes that Professor Bosteels raised this evening. We are lifelong learners, many of whom have revisited beloved core curriculum texts this past year, perhaps with different interpretations than when in Hamilton Hall with our classmates years ago. So, to my fellow lifelong learners, please feel free to continue submitting questions via the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And we will kick it off with a question from James, who asks, what do you make of Matthew Ristall's when Montezuma met Cortez?
I'm not sure that I understood the first part of the question.
So he asks, what do you make of Matthew Ristall's? I don't know if that's a name of a critic who has written about Montezuma meeting Cortez.
Yeah, I'm not sure what critic this question is referring to. So what I was trying to do was go back to a sort of a moment in time to see how there are echoes, not so much to do an objective historical reconstruction of what happened during the conquest with the much debated issues over what was being said, what was the role of Moctezuma, or what was the cause of his death, but rather to go back and look at some of the things that are, in a sense, lost between the lines in the indigenous account, where they make references to cultural habits or formations or social structures that were in the process, of course, of being overhauled, and that would come back to haunt the subsequent history of Mexico with sort of a retrieval of some of the lost promises of those ancient times.
Great. Thank you, Professor. We have another question. Are you saying that and forgive me if I mispronounce this word, are you saying that the Calpuque are descendants of the Aztecs?
No, so there's, as I mentioned, there is a huge debate over the nature of this Calpuli, which is a term used to define basically a territorial unit, but according to some interpreters, is also a form of a large family structure, and therefore based on blood relations and kinship, which over the course of the years has been diminished and reduced to a simple administrative or territorial subdivision in the city of Tenochtitlan. But as a memory, it clearly lingers in many texts and is referred to as a way of life or a mode of living, of communal living, that was supposedly lost either already under the pressure of the centralized Aztec Empire or under the influence of the invading Spaniards. And so when in 1909, in a meeting in the town of Anenequilco, according to this historian, Emiliano Zapata is elected the chief of the unit of the Calpuli of his hometown. It shows sort of a discontinuous continuity in history. So we're not talking about genealogical descendants, but rather social structures that have survived the onslaught of time and come back as the index of a promise of something that was lost, either already during the centralization of the empire that was located in Tenochtitlan with the Triple Alliance, or subsequently during 4 centuries of colonization.
So we have a comment that's not so much a question. It's a sort of a comment that an alum would like you to react to, which is about the Franciscans and Dominicans being founded as inquisitors. Augustine said, do not kill the Jewish population just to make sure that they do not prosper. Could you speak to this sort of comment and drawing on, I guess, your question about the how it relates to teaching to today's classroom?
Well, there is a lot written on the role of the Franciscan and Dominicans, and of course the Jesuits in the endeavor of colonization and evangelization. There is a fascinating take on the role, in particular, of the group of originally 12 Franciscan friars who arrived in Mexico and had a sort of millenarian utopian expectation about the indigenous population as being more ready to become pure Christians than the old Christians in the old Europe. And so when people like Sahagún and others, including those who were charged with doing sort of audits of the way the laws were applied for the king in Spain, such as Alonso de Zorita, who was one of those auditors in New Spain or current-day Mexico, they were keen on trying to understand the past customs and habits of the indigenous populations, because they believed that there was they had an idealized notion close to what Rousseau would call the tradition of the noble savage. This is still not different from the outlook of the evangelizers. So I'm not sort of idealizing their interpretation of the indigenous population, but their almost proto-ethnographic work nonetheless led to a sustained engagement with the differences in the ways of life between the Spanish and the indigenous populations. And so if we have today access to some of the documents that explain the way social, economic, political, military, and administrative and religious life was governed prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, it is to no small extent due to the work of Franciscan friars such as Bernardino de Sahagún, whom I quoted in his vast, hundreds of pages of the general history of things of New Spain, covering both earthly and religious aspects, just as Augustine did in the City of God, which starts out with giving sort of consolation for those who are suffering in the earthly city. So rather than completely throwing these religious figures overboard as being embedded within a colonial enterprise, I think it is important to try to retrieve and read their books against the grain, as Walter Benjamin was suggesting, in order to see if we can listen to the voices of those who are being exploited and oppressed, and if they speak through and in between the lines of these accounts written by the Christian evangelizers. So that was my attempt, not to rewrite history, but rather to bring into contact different moments of time and history that otherwise, on a so-called progressive line of development of the so-called West, would not be conjoined.
Thank you, Professor. I think this next question dovetails with the last one, perhaps. The question is, what strategies do you recommend for retrieving lost histories if most of our core historical accounts are written by the victors?
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, that speaks to sort of the core of the proposal. And it's also a concern that I hear throughout my experience teaching in the core, which is precisely as I started out saying at the beginning, we know that these great books courses are under attack, while others are trying to defend them as being, you know, the supreme treasures of Western civilization. And I think we neither have to celebrate them nor throw them overboard completely. It is really a question of looking for those textual and interpretive strategies for reading what continues to be a text written by the victors, and most often as a mode of controlling any type of rebellion or resistance, to read it against the grain in order to look at its sort of unspoken underside, those voices that speak through even when the intention of the author of the text is meant to subdue those rebellious or resilient voices. And that's sort of the whole difficulty of a course such as CC or LitHum, I imagine, although I'm more familiar with contemporary civilization, because even though there are many attempts made with revising the syllabus, which is going on right now as we speak again, and new texts have been added to the basic canon, including the one that I quoted today from the Broken Spears, which gives the Aztec accounts of the conquest of Mexico and of the New World, which was not the case, of course, in previous versions. So people who would have taken this 20, 30 years ago would not have read those indigenous accounts. But today you do read those accounts. And I think it's also important that one reads them as part of the core, including within contemporary civilization, and not relegate them, whether it's to area studies or to the global core, but rather understand this imbrication, this almost tragic intertwinement of what Walter Benjamin calls the almost codependence between civilization and barbarism. If one keeps that in mind as a constant reminder that what we are reading is a document written by the victors, and that there are voices that are not heard in this, and that we should at least try to lend an ear and understand in the native language as much as possible those unheard voices.
Well, I can certainly attest that 22 years ago when I took CC, that we also asked these same questions about the lost histories and what, you know, is perhaps unsaid. And many of my professors certainly asked us to really kind of scrutinize and ask those important questions. We have another question from an alumnus, Ricardo. Do you think the redemption you speak of can take place without reparations or other financial remediation made to the oppressed?
The quick answer would be no. The more complicated answer would be that the reparation would be part of this sort of promise of redemption. What Walter Benjamin had in mind was, in a sense, a more thoroughgoing transformation of society as a whole. So he associated that also with a revolutionary change that would completely have to transform our very mode of existence. And therefore, reparations, if it's understood in financial terms, would not even begin to meet the expectation of such a promise.
So our next question is from alumna Joan. Why not global culture overview instead of CC in the West as a core curriculum course at Columbia?
Well, I think this is part of the goal that Columbia is trying to meet with the many courses in the global core. And expanding the requirement for students also to fulfill the requirements in global culture. I believe that over the past years, the intent of the committee in charge of deciding the syllabi for both CC and LitHum have increasingly tried to make these courses global. And I think it's important to not make this sort of a divide between the West and the rest. Because if we do so, then very often we also reduce the West to the centralized civilization with the great texts that, because they have been dominant and transmitted across the centuries in ways that make them seem unavoidable, they also appear to be sort of the standard for what it means to construct or build up a moral or political system or a philosophy, such as the texts that are being read in contemporary civilization. Whereas very often then, what people read of the rest of the world, the non-West, is reduced to cultural idiosyncrasies that would be omitted from the dominant view of the West. And I believe it's important to understand on an equal footing that the capacity for producing critical thought is the same in the West and in the rest. And that this divide between sort of the potential for philosophical reflection that would have characterized the West since the ancient Greeks, which is a fairly recent invention, no older than the Romantics in the 18th and 19th century, versus the more anthropological or ethnographic accounts of non-Western cultures. I think this is an important part of this attempt to really globalize these courses in the core, to also understand that people are doing critical thought, no less in Chile or in Japan, in South Korea, or in France and Italy. And that therefore, what we consider to be the standard bearers of moral or political philosophy should be found also in texts that otherwise are relegated to courses in literature or culture. This is why I mentioned that I am uncomfortable with the split between LitHum and CC, because I believe that these texts are sort of modes of making sense of one's own contradictory existence. And therefore, if a TV show or a novel adopts a melodramatic or a tragic structure that is no less philosophical or theoretically poignant than a treatise about what it means to have a good will.
So our next question is from Arthur. He asks, do you see a pattern of most civilizations identifying a group as not entitled to having human rights? And some examples that Arthur provides are the Roman slaves, indigenous Native Americans, the Jewish population, Black Americans, unborn children.
Yes, of course. This is part of the reason why so many instructors also are aware and feel uncomfortable with some of the underlying ideas behind the core. Because if we are asked to speak about the human experience, as I was today, I believe it should happen, and I try to suggest this between the lines, that the human experience is unevenly distributed on a global scale, and that the victors who write the history annals have also constantly established hierarchies within what counts as human and what counts as non-human or infrahuman or subhuman. And most often, particularly in modern times, this has happened along racialized and ethnicized lines and gendered lines and the combination of those. And therefore, this task of sort of brushing history against the grain also has to deal with that aspect of the tendency, as the person behind the question suggests, of humanity to define itself according to limited entitlement to basic human rights, and relegating entire portions of the human population to those who are unentitled to those rights, or do not even count as human, or not in the same way as the dominant image of the human that would be the white West.
And I just want to remind our alumni audience that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to Professor Bosteels. Our next question is from John. In Mexico, Central and South America, are there great thinkers and philosophers that are different to, or perhaps not included in our CC?
Yes, that's in a sense, for me, almost a daily question, which is, why aren't there more thinkers or philosophers or theorists well-known and read beyond Central America or South America or the Caribbean, while they are obviously producing fascinating work and have continued to do so, no less than the canonical works that typically appear on the syllabi of a core course. And this is sort of an endless question, because if you remind colleagues who do not have to work on or do not even have to follow or keep up to date with those developments, why they are not reading this Mexican or Ecuadorian philosopher, as well as the Italians or the Germans or the French that are always instantly translated and make it to the bestseller lists of the major publishing houses, very often they will sort of roll their eyes and wonder, well, but if so-and-so says pretty much the same thing as what this famous German philosopher says, why should I start reading what an Ecuadorian or a Chilean or a Japanese philosopher has to say? And this is not something that we are going to change just by sheer willpower. There are, of course, cultural hegemonies at stake here, which means questions about what gets translated, what gets published, what gets transmitted, what gets taught is based on shifting political powers. And so until the global power structures also shift, we will not see a change in their typical reading lists. But I am sort of heartened by the fact that, but thanks to the internet and the ease with which we can share documents, even though very often then the question of translation is a crucial and painful one, because it means that these texts will only become accessible to a broader audience if they are written or translated into the main languages that are understandable by the vast majority of the world population, which would mean English, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic, and so on. I myself, as a Flemish speaker, don't speak the language. And there are basically 30 million people who speak Flemish in the world. So what happens with texts that are written in that language? Who is going to make the efforts or pay for the translations? Who is going to look at what happens? We have, as many of my colleagues in the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society know very well, because they've started a whole project about this in terms of language justice. We have so many languages that are being threatened by extinction, that it also means that we have whole traditions of cultural work and thought that are being lost as we speak, because they are no longer transmittable, because there is no longer an audience capable of reading them. So I'm, as well as a teacher, I'm also a translator, and I do my best to somehow bring some of these Latin American theoretical and philosophical texts into English. But this is a slow process and an uphill battle for which funds are always lacking, because due to those cultural hegemonies that I mentioned before, we will still first see the translations of European philosophy before we see any engagement with critical thought from Asia, Africa, or Latin America.
Our next question comes from Tim. With respect to what you have said in this question and answer period, what was your reaction to Howard University eliminating its classics department, if you find the event relevant, vis-a-vis the theme of Victor's writing history?
That's a difficult and interesting question. I've talked about this a little bit with some of my colleagues in the classics department at Columbia University. It's an understandable gesture of brushing history so far against the grain that cancellation seems to be the only option to sort of rectify or adjust the records. And it is, of course, true that classics departments have had an important role, very often nefarious role, in the colonial expansion of Western civilization. The Franciscan friar that I mentioned, Sahagún, was able to both spread the gospel, but also work on his proto-ethnographic account of indigenous culture, because he set up a college, a trilingual college, in which Latin was the mediating language between Spanish and Nahuatl. And that's a phenomenon that repeats itself throughout the colonial world, where Latin in particular plays this role of the lingua franca. Even the very expression of lingua franca is sort of doubly symptomatic of that. And in response to this dominant role of classics departments as part of a colonial project, it is understandable that some people would like to completely cancel or close the department. As you can probably guess, from the way I was trying to mobilize Walter Benjamin, I am more in favor of reading the tradition against the grain and trying to retrieve, even within those traditions, those other voices that are muted, but can nonetheless be found in almost every text. I often tell the students in my class that it's almost worth as much to spend a long amount of time with a particular text, especially if it's a sophisticated sort of attempt to develop a strong, systematic, moral or political account of the ideal way of life, even if one firmly disagrees with every aspect of that text. But working one's way through a text like that, testing one's own opinions against the even prejudicial nature of some of those texts, sometimes produces effects that cannot be found or obtained if one simply sets aside that entire tradition. So this is why I spoke in terms of sort of a critical humanities program, or what Walter Benjamin called the sort of the necessary dissociation or detachment that one has to have with regard to the great treasures of so-called Western civilization. How did these treasures even come to stand for Western civilization in the first place? The West is a very recent concept. As an ex-colleague from Cornell University, Naoki Sakai, a Japanese scholar very interested in translation, said and showed the West is basically an invention of the late 19th century. Before that, particularly the Congo Conference, in which, of course, Western European countries were deciding what the future was going to be of their colonies. Before the Congo Conference, almost nobody spoke in terms of the West. People spoke about Europe. Friedrich Nietzsche, whom most of you will have read in CC, never spoke about the West. He always spoke about Europe and European nihilism. It is only at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that people begin to speak of the West. And the West is an entirely relative concept, because there's always something that's west of what otherwise counts as East. So it's an empty geographical concept that merely designates a cultural hegemony. So studying that, I think, can be productive if we do it critically. It doesn't mean that we simply have to let go of all those great books, it means that we have to read them with such a critical eye, trying to understand both the original language and the modes of life or the cultural forms of existence that speak through them, as a way of turning them against the dominant views in which these great treasures have been presented.
Thank you. As I stated, I do recall that my professors, Caroline Bynum and Gayatri Spivak, certainly asked us to, ask these same questions 22 years ago. We are almost at time, so this will be our last question, Professor Bosteels. If you could pick a handful of books to add to the core in order to advance and further the question, the existing curriculum, what might they be?
That's a very tough question. Also because it changes from day to day, right? In terms of one's own research projects and which books suddenly sit at the forefront of one's own thinking. But one book that has been recently translated as part of a series that is brought out by a consortium of critical theory programs in the United States, led by Professor Judith Butler from the University of California, Berkeley. It's a series called Critical South that tries to translate at last many of these texts from Africa or Asia or Latin America into English. And as somebody who focuses mostly on Latin American, there was one book in particular that for me has been sort of a striking, because I didn't know it, because it is not a central work of this author. Is an Ecuadorian Mexican philosopher who passed away a few years ago, Bolívar Echeverría, and he wrote a book called Modernity and Whiteness, Modernidad y Blanquitud. And so he writes in a sense about how this concept of civilization that is associated with a racialized identification of what it means to be human, equated with whiteness, which he sees not just in terms of skin color, but in terms of sort of a cultural set of attitudes and habits and expectations. Therefore, he separates blanquitud, or whiteness in quotation marks, this is difficult to render in English, from blancura, which would be the whiteness of the skin. And studies, again, in this critical fashion, how modernity has become indissociable from that racialization. For me, that's a significant text that goes back to a long tradition of critical thought in Latin America, based in the same tradition out of which Walter Benjamin also came. And that would be just one example of figures, but there's a number of leftists, feminists, indigenous thinkers, or decolonial thinkers in Latin America that should figure on all syllabi, including of CC. But I understand, of course, that the core also wants to preserve a certain loyalty to a tradition that has defined Colombia for decades.
Well, thank you. If it were up to Columbia College alumni, we would keep you, Professor Bosteels, for an entire semester of continued conversation. I know I speak for the class of 2001 that we wish we could have these conversations again in Philosophy Hall, but we will mark our calendars for our next milestone year. Thank you, Professor Bosteels, for engaging with us today. And thank you to the Columbia alumni for joining us from your homes or your offices this evening. There will also be more exciting reunion events this week, so please consider connecting with your classmates at those events. We hope to see you there. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Mary.